In this final module of the course, we'll take a look at scope and the concept of hoisting. These are concepts that can throw you off if you're not fully aware of them. So we'll take a close look and see some of the problems that could come up. We'll start off global. Next, we'll take a look at functions scope, and we'll see how functions look at their surrounding functions when they're looking up variable names. And we'll see some examples of functions within functions, and eventually looking to the global scope to find a variable. We'll take a look at the var keyword and the concept of hoisting. We saw var earlier in the course, and we saw that it was better to be working with the const keyword for constants and the let keyword for variables that can change. But we need to look at this in a little bit more detail and see how the concept of hoisting works with variables and functions. JavaScript is backwards compatible with its very early versions. And in very early versions of JavaScript, you didn't have to declare variables. And this can throw you off. But there is a fix, and the fix has to do with strict mode. So we'll see how to put our code into strict mode and solve any undeclared variable problems. Let's get started and look in more detail at global scope. Let's take a look at global scope. Mainly there are two scopes in JavaScript. You have global scope and function scope. And scope refers to the area in which you can access a variable. Variables get declared in a scope. I'm here in home.js, and when we start coding directly in this JavaScript file, we're in the global scope. If we create a variable here, this new variable, product ID, can be accessed anywhere in our application. And just to show that, let me create a function. We'll call it showProductID, and we'll simply log out the product ID. So this product ID here is not declared in the function. It's declared in the global scope. And we need to call this function, and I'll save it. And we get the product ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So even though product ID is not declared in the function, it looks outward to the global scope to find the product ID. And of course, if there was never a product ID in the global scope, I'll comment this out, and I'll save it. You can see that we get an error. Product ID is not defined. Global scope is more than what you see here. It's actually the sum total of all your JavaScript files. If we look at index.html, you'll remember that we have two JavaScript files, utils.js and home.js. So the global scope actually refers to utils.js, which is right here. We can see that in this global scope, we're defining two functions. And also in home.js. This is a continuation of the global scope. Your application may have dozens or more JavaScript files, all of which combine to give you one global scope. One concept you may have heard about is called polluting the global scope, and that's bad. That occurs when you have too many variables being declared globally in the global scope. For example, we have product ID, and I'll add a few more. And if all of your JavaScript files are doing this, declaring variables all over the place in the global scope, things can get very confusing. Bugs can start showing up. So generally what JavaScript developers do is they create only one variable in the global scope, and we can make it a constant, and we'll call it app for application. And that'll be an object, and any variables that we have will become properties of that object. We have to make sure we use colons instead of equal signs. And we don't need the final semicolon. But now we have a single object in the global scope. And whenever a developer needs some kind of information in the global scope, they can just use this application object. So if we save this now, it's not going to work because there's no product ID. So we have to make sure that we access app.productID. I'll save it. And now it's working. Of course, you may have many functions in the global scope, but it's a good idea only to have one application object to hold any data you need globally. In the next clip, we'll take a look at function scope. Now let's take a look at function scope. We've seen this earlier in the course, but let's take a closer look. We have our function showProductID, and we're calling the function on line 6. When we declare a variable within a function, it has function scope. So we'll let product ID equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's log out product ID. I'll save this. And we get what we expected, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this product ID variable is in function scope. We cannot access it outside of the function. We'll log it out here. And I'll comment this line out within the function. I'll save it. And we can see that product ID is not defined. So product ID has function scope. And it's not only the case with variables. Parameters are similar to variables. Let's add the product ID here. And we'll pass in a product ID. And we'll make sure to move the log underneath the function call. I'll save it. And we get our error, product ID is not defined. So whether it's a parameter name or a local variable, it has function scope. I'll undo this, and let's create a function within this function. And I'll just call it fix. And let's create a variable here with the same name. Let product ID equal 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we'll log that out. We'll say in fix, and we'll show the product ID. And we'll keep our console.log here in our show product ID function in show product ID. And we know that this is not needed anymore, and we can take out our final log statement. So we're going to call show product ID, and we'll declare this fix function, and let's make sure we call that. So fix has a variable called product ID, and the outer function, show product ID, has a variable called product ID. Let's see what we get. I'll save it. And the first output we get comes from the fix function, where product ID is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But you can see that when that function finishes execution, the local variable is gone, and we're back to using the product ID in the outer function. So this product ID went out of scope as soon as fix completed execution. And this product ID came back into scope after fix completed execution. So you need to be aware of the scope of variables. If we took this product ID out, now we're accessing product ID within the fix function. I'll save it. And you can see we don't get an error. What happens is the function looks to its outer function and looks for the variable there. That's why we show the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and then show it again. And if product ID didn't exist at all within this function, we'll make it global. I'll save this. And it still works. So our function fix does not have product ID in its local scope. It looks to the outer scope, and it doesn't find a product ID there either. Finally, it looks to the global scope, and it finds the product ID. So if you run into a situation where variables don't seem to be set correctly, look for duplicate variable names, and look at the various scopes that your functions are called from. And remember that parameters work a lot like local variables. They disappear when the function finishes execution. In the next clip, we'll take a look at the var keyword again and the concept of hoisting. Let's look at the var keyword and the concept of hoisting. We saw var earlier in this course, and we learned that it's much better to be using let or const to declare variables and or constants. And one of the reasons for that has to do with hoisting. Let's see what that is. So we'll use var to declare a variable, and let's try to access that before it's declared. We'll log it out. I'll save it, and we get undefined. And to make things more confusing, let's set product ID to a value. I'll save it. So we're working with product ID. It's set to 456, but we haven't declared it yet. And that's what hoisting refers to. Hoisting means that the identifier product ID right here will be set to undefined when this JavaScript file is executed. But that's not what we want at all. We want to be working with let or const. So I'll change this to let, save it, and we get the error that we expected. Cannot access product ID before initialization. So this concept of using a variable before it's declared is not a good idea at all, and we should be using let and const. But this does not apply to functions. I'll create a function, and we'll call it show product ID, and I'll just log out a value. And what happens if we try to execute this function before it's declared? We'll call show product ID, and I'll save it. and we get the value 123. So in effect, this showProductID function is hoisted. We can actually call the function before we define it. And that's because it's a function declaration and it gets hoisted to the top. And the actual mechanism behind hoisting has to do with the fact that the JavaScript file gets executed after 2 passes. So in the first pass, the JavaScript engine will know there's a function called showProductID, and in the second pass, it'll actually execute things from the top down. So that's why the call to showProductID is successful, even though the function has not been declared yet. So hoisting is fine for functions like this, but for variables and constants, make sure to use let and const and avoid var. That way any hoisting problems can be avoided. In the next clip, we'll take a closer look at undeclared variables and strict mode. In early versions of JavaScript, you could start using variables without declaring them. And that's really a bad idea. After a few releases, JavaScript created a fix for that. Let's take a look at Visual Studio Code. So let's just create a variable, but we won't use any var, let, or const keyword. And we'll log it out. I'll save this. And we get 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is a big problem, especially in larger projects. You always want to declare your variables. In fact, what's happening here is product ID is being declared on an object called window. If we log out window.productID, I'll save this. And you can see we get the same value. If you look at the history of JavaScript, window referred mainly to the window of the browser where your application is running. But many global variables got placed in window. And with subsequent releases of JavaScript, developers wanted to avoid that. They didn't want window to become a dumping ground for all kinds of variables. So a new feature was added to the language where you can specify a string called useStrict. And just by putting this string above your other code, it puts the JavaScript file into what's called strict mode. And this forces you to declare your variables. Let me just fix up this log. I'll remove the window portion of it, and I'll save it. And now we get the error that we want. Product ID is not defined. So one thing you might want to do in all your JavaScript files is to begin it with this useStrict string. Of course, we can get rid of the error by properly adding a let or const keyword. I'll save it. And now we get the answer we expected. Here we see useStrict used in the global space, but you can also use it for individual functions as well. This is a beginner course in JavaScript, but as you learn more advanced features such as modules and classes, you'll find out that useStrict is already implied. You don't need to specify it. But if you're writing code like we've covered in this course, it's a good idea to always use this string, useStrict, so the compiler knows that you're in strict mode. We started off this module by looking at global scope. We saw how any function in any of our code can access items in the global scope. We also saw how it's a good idea not to pollute the global scope and keep any variables or values that we need in a single object. Usually you'll see an object like that called app for application. Next, we looked at function scope, and we saw how names get resolved. Let's say we're looking for a variable name. If it doesn't exist in that function, it looks in the next surrounding function, and then in that function's surrounding function, and so on, up until you reach the global scope. If it doesn't find the variable name anywhere, it's an error. Next, we looked at var and hoisting. We know we want to use the let and const keywords instead of var. But when it comes to function declarations, those are fine. They get hoisted, but there's no problem with that. Finally, we took a look at undeclared variables and how we can make sure that our variables must be declared by using strict mode. We put a magic string at the beginning of our code, and it can be in single quotes or double quotes, and it simply says use strict. By doing this, we can make sure that errors show up if we have undeclared variables, which is good. And that wraps up this course, JavaScript Getting Started. You now know all the basic features of JavaScript and can start writing valuable applications. To really become proficient at this, you should take each feature and make lots of sample applications. So good luck creating your applications in JavaScript.